My very first question is, where were you born?
I was born in Vancouver. I grew up in North Vancouver, and I first moved to Victoria in 1989, which is a long time ago, to go to university at the University of Victoria.
My name is Kristi, and I was born in Nassau, Bahamas.
What led you to Canada then?
My mom actually is from the Bahamas, and she comes from a large family of 9 brothers and sisters, and my father is a Canadian, and he happened to be in the Bahamas working for a period of time. They met, they fell in love, and they got married. They had my sister and I, and then over time, I was quite a young little girl, like 3 or 4. They moved us to Canada.
Oh, nice. So you have dual citizenship then?
I do.
I was born in Vancouver, BC.
I'm assuming you went to uni or a college. Where did you go for that?
I went to UVic, so I didn't go too far from Vancouver.
No, and then what was your major, or what did you study?
I studied child and youth care.
And what did you major in at the UVic?
I have a degree in English and philosophy.
Can you just tell me a bit about your experiences while you were at UVic?
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed my time there. I think that in the early 90s, which is mostly when I was there, it was pretty hippie actually, more so than a business school. I think that I don't remember knowing any students in the business department or the faculty of management or whatever it's called. A big campus, but it was a small campus. It's now huge. I think it's there's 3 times as many buildings. When I was there was a lot of open space between the buildings, and now all the former open space is filled with buildings. Yeah. So I don't even know what they do in all those buildings, but it's a lot of buildings. So I think that the feel of the university has changed quite a bit, probably in 35 years since I first started there. Yeah, it's still a beautiful campus. I like reading a lot. I liked reading about ideas and stories and the kind of touchstones of our culture. Yeah, that's what captured me then, let's say.
Maybe hero's journey or one of the sort of the templates.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't learn about that stuff until later actually, but I really enjoyed the big ideas.
Yeah, I went to Camosun College, and then I went to University of Victoria.
Okay, and what did you study?
I actually studied Asian Pacific Studies. So I was very interested in the Pacific Rim and the business side of things, but the focus for me was also the environmental side and how those intersected together, the business and the environment.
I'm very curious then, one thing I've noticed is my friends and people I know went to uni, aren't necessarily doing the same thing they went to university for, which I think is natural. I think the big thing with the university is learning how to learn and building a network and just going through that experience. So how did you transition from studying that to more to community-based programs? Was it something you always had in the back of your head of maybe I'll study this? I guess, did you have a specific intention when you went to study university?
Yeah, I went to university thinking I would become a counselor because I really enjoy hearing people's stories and just holding space for storytelling and understanding people and supporting and helping them. What I realized when I went to university was that I really loved that piece of me and I didn't want it as a profession because it would lose something, my personal opinion for me. And so I started taking different classes, and I took one class that was about Asian Pacific Studies, and I loved it. So I went to a counselor at school at the university and just asked what I should do because I was kind of halfway through. And they said to take a semester that I just did heavy course loads on Asian Pacific Studies. And once I did that, I fell in love with it. And I really value that sort of intersection of that business and social good and the interconnectedness of our community. That really led me to my studies, which I focused a lot on that environmental and business piece. I think it was a natural evolution for me to think about how can I bring about social change. So for me, social change is environmental, social, and cultural impact. So I think it was a natural sort of evolution. I finished my studies in Japan, then traveled for a couple years and came back to Canada. And so then I was ready to sort of see where I could fit. And some of my best jobs, I got from volunteering or, learning. And then once I was in the world of nonprofits and charities, I just could see that there was a way that we could look at our business models a little differently inside of charities and nonprofits that will allow us to really scale impact. Which again, for me, went back to how do we place people, planet, and profit at the center of the economy. I figured if I could support strengthening, originally when I went into Oakland's Community Center, I thought, I'll strengthen organizations. And maybe you go one organization by one organization by one organization. You really work to try to figure out how to help that particular organization have the positive impact that it wants to have, the community impact it wants to have. And then I had met Kristi, Fairholm Mater, and we used to go for walks and just sort of think about what was possible. And so I thought, I either go organization by organization, or perhaps we start to look at the lessons that we've learned and we come together and create something, an entity that enables us to support the sector on a very wide way, in a very broad way.
Doing research on it, you've been involved in lots of sort of community-based work, and I'm wondering where that interest came from.
I grew up in a small town, and I really noticed the impact that business could have on community. There was a time when I come from a small town that was a one industry town. There was a strike that took place, and I saw the impact of the strike, what that could do to families. And so I always really thought that you could place people, the planet, and profit simultaneously in the economy, and that there was a different way of doing things. So that really led me to how do I support the people and planet side of the work, because the profit seems that piece is fine, and so really led me to think about what it could look like to support organizations that were doing really good things. And so I lived in Vancouver for a bit, and I was the director of fund development for Vision Vancouver. At that time, that was a municipal political party. And it really taught me, being involved with that group and being, in politics, really taught me what it looked like to engage community and be able to scale impact through politics. And so when I moved to Victoria, I really wanted to take that kind of understanding and bring it into neighborhoods and communities. And so I became an executive director of a community center here. And that was my first sort of real leadership role at the executive level in a nonprofit.
And that would be
Oakland's
Community Center?
Yes.
Cool. How did you even begin to get into the non-profit sector, or was there one moment where you're maybe I should try this, or was it like a gradual thing?
Yeah, it was by accident. When I was in graduate school in Toronto, I went to York University in a different area than in my undergrad, environmental studies. I remember I had some frustration with the Graduate Environmental Studies Students Association and the position that they'd taken on something. So I decided, when there was an announcement in the hallway to go to a meeting, I decided to go to the meeting. And basically, there were 4 or 5 of us who were upset at 4 or 5 people who were all graduating in a month and leaving. Mm-hmm. And they basically said, "You're running it now, good luck." And they handed us the binder and...
Jesus, talk about sink or swim.
Exactly. So that was my first, literally my first introduction to working in the nonprofit sector as a volunteer director. But we had a ton of fun. We made some, I think, relatively useful reforms and improved the life of graduate students through the work we did, and hopefully for more than just a year coming in behind us, but for many years thereafter, I don't know though. But that gave me a taste of, hey, you can show up, and if you care, you can get involved, and if you have something to contribute, they'll put you in charge, and you'll have a budget and a team, and you can start having fun. So I got a taste for it.
It reminds me of almost like planting a tree, where good foundation basically, and it sounds like you had a good foundation to pull from, at least, at the very beginning there. And then when you got out of uni, did you know what you wanted to do?
Yeah, great question. I had sort of, when I was at UVic, the last couple of years that I was at UVic, there was the war in the woods, the Clayoquot Sound protests and so on. I wasn't involved directly in those, but I was very sympathetic to the cause for sure. And as a result of which, decided to go to Toronto and pursue a graduate degree in environmental studies, with a thought that when I came back, I would be able to either get work in government or in an NGO, potentially contributing to environmental causes. That actually did not happen, but I do feel that the work that I did in my environmental studies degree has been very useful throughout my career and my life. It was an interdisciplinary program, and so I worked with people in a range of different disciplines, and as a result learn about what other people needed to do in order to be successful, how they thought about things, how they worked on problems, how they tried to solve them, and then also learned about how, as a leader, you could bring different groups of people together with different expertise to solve problems and make things happen. And that's been a useful discipline for me through my whole life.
Is that what got you into the quote-unquote nonprofit sector?
No. I was walking down the street in my neighborhood. I moved back to live in Fernwood. I was literally walking down the street, and there was this old guy who was putting up posters. I said to him, I'd seen him around before, he's quite an animated character, and so I just engaged him in conversation. I said, what's that poster about? And he started this long story about how the community center was being taken over by people from other neighborhoods, and that was no good, and that there was going to be an important meeting actually, and that's what he was postering about. And then he looked at me with his blue eyes and said, "You'll be there, right?" And I just felt like,
you're kind of put on the spot.
This is a defining moment. I said, yeah, I'll come. And so then, I had to make a note of it, and because we didn't have phones in those days. But anyways, no QR code to take a photo of, so I had to write it down, and I remembered to show up. That's how I got involved with, at that time, what was called the Fernwood Community Center Society. And in a similar kind of a way, I attended a meeting and spoke up, and then the next thing I knew, I was on the board, and a few months later, they made me the president. I was involved with that organization for 22 years.
What were you, 25 at the time, or
26?
26.
I'd had a good foundation of schooling, but no real practical life experience, let's say. And so it was a great opportunity for me to really learn what it meant to be a community leader, and to think about an organization and what an organization needed to do in order to create value for the community.
I'm kind of curious how Scale formed. If you could just take me back to how even that kernel of an idea became
Sure.
fruition.
That's a better question for Kristi and Kristi, because the two of them actually founded Scale. But I'll tell you how I got involved, which was very close to the beginning of Scale, but not the actual founding. One of their first projects that they took on was a project that they had an idea for. They kind of had this idea which they called Social Enterprise Catalyst. Mm-hmm. And this is maybe in 2014. I had been actually quite an active social enterprise in my time in Fernwood. We had bought buildings, we'd started businesses, we built buildings, but we were sort of known quite widely at that point already in Victoria for being very socially enterprising. Actually, by that point in Fernwood, we had incorporated a subsidiary corporation and bought we started a business and then we incorporated it and then we bought an additional business and so on. So there was like a lot of like enterprising activity. And so they were kind of new in town, I would say, and I wasn't really that familiar with them, but they had already kind of learned that I was a person that they needed to get to know in this pursuit of social enterprise, being a social enterprise catalyst. And so they had this great event and they decided to hold it at the Belfry, which literally was across the street from my office was in Fernwood, right? And so they invited me and I was like, okay, sure, I'll come. I had no idea who they were. I was pretty sure that the event was gonna suck because in my experience, most of these things suck. Like, people have a good idea, but they don't really have the skills to execute. I had low expectations, let's just say. I went to the event, and it was awesome. It was amazing. Like, it was really well organized. There was a tremendous audience. They had politicians and other, notable people in the community show up and care, which is amazing, and that they were able to sort of build a profile for what they were trying to do that quickly. I had been working for government in the early part of my career. I had left government to become the executive director of Fernwood. At that time, it had changed its name from the Community Center Society to Fernwood Neighborhood Resource Group Society. Yeah. But I became the executive director in 2009, and so this is now 5 years later. I had been doing some kind of consulting work, let's say, on the side, but it was very government focused and frankly was boring me to tears already by 2014. And when I saw them do this fantastic event, and participated in this fantastic event, I thought about it for about maybe a few days and then I called them and said, I'd like to meet. And when we met, I pitched to them that I would like to leave my government-focused consulting work behind and start some nonprofit-focused consulting work inside Scale with them. They thought about it and said yes, and in 2015 I joined Scale and I continued to work as the full-time executive director of Fernwood Neighborhood Resource Group Society for a further, let's say, 4 years, from 2015, maybe 5 years, 2015 to 2019. I continued to work full-time in Fernwood, but I did a little bit of nonprofit consulting on the side, and I became quite convinced that there was a real need for it and B, a real demand. There was resources to support people who had experience and knowledge in the nonprofit sector to help others come along. In 2019, we all made a decision together that we were going to go into Scale full-time, and that actually leads into the story of theDock. So if you want to ask me that question.
Well, I mean, I started as a youth worker in Victoria, working with street youth here. And so I feel like kids have always kind of framed my perspective and mentality. I think the challenges that are facing young people are the same but different as they were. And I do think, though, as I get older, I'm starting to think about legacy and transition and how are we really taking care of the upcoming generation.
Before we do, actually, I want to talk to you a little bit about Fernwood, because obviously it seems to be a bit of a brief quarantine. Yeah. So can you just give me the why you have such a fondness for that area?
When you say fondness for that particular area of Victoria, like I first moved to Fernwood fall of 1992. And I didn't know anything about the neighborhood. We kind of lived in this, like it was a roommate type situation, classic student dive roommate situation.
Oh, I lived in a few of those.
Yeah, and my life was very focused on the campus and going up there every day or most days, and so on. I wasn't really that oriented to the neighborhood. Eventually I moved out and moved in with someone else, and we got a place on Grant Street, and I started to get sort of more interested in the characteristics of the neighborhood, and I really, really liked it. Like, the mature trees, the old buildings, the houses, and the buildings that are close to the street and oriented to the street. The fact that in those days anyways, there was a real active nightlife in downtown Fernwood, but you could go to the Fernwood Community Association and there would be dances and political speeches and bowl sessions and arts like open stage kind of arts performances. You never knew what you were going to get. I just sort of fell in love with the neighborhood. And when I moved to Toronto in 1995 and started studying environmental studies, I did a bunch of courses on sort of urban design, urban development, and realized what it was that I really loved about the neighborhood in a more intellectual way. The fact that it's defined by this sort of network of major streets, but that there's this grid, not sort of windy roads, but a grid of, an internal grid of sort of narrower streets where, like I say, mature trees, houses that are close to the street, like all those things are actually, frankly, very good principles of urban design, and they're features that are not as common now in new neighborhoods. And so if people say, oh, this neighborhood doesn't really have a lot of character, that's one of the reasons why, right? And so I think that's one of the things that people appreciate about Fernwood is it does have tremendous character. When I was coming back to Victoria in 1997, for a bit I was going to move in with my brother while he finished his final year at UVic. Like he was going to find us a place to live for September, and he said, where do you want to live? And I said, between Bay Street, Shelburne, Fort Street, and Cook Street. Like it was like, he's like, a whole city, and you want to live in like 30 square blocks. And I'm like, yep, I do. He found a place. It was terrible. We didn't stay there that long. But then I moved to another place in Fernwood and lived in the neighborhood and was oriented and got involved shortly after that in the community center, and then been involved in that neighborhood for a further 22 years.
I mean, one below, during COVID, the only thing that hit close to home is when my friend's family used to run Logan's Pub, and I always consider that a community center more so than a pub, because you go there any night of the week. Very broad clientele, put it kindly. But it was a dirtiness, like a magic to it. Like everyone was there, like very genuine, and it's the only place that closed out of the whole COVID where I'm like, oh man, you can't replace that place, unfortunately. Scale came before theDock.
Scale did come before. So Scale Collaborative, Kristi and I co-founded Scale Collaborative in 2014. This is our 10-year anniversary.
Yeah. I just went to the party at Beacon on Saturday. It was a blast. You only had one injury, so it's all good.
Okay, so we're in this really wonderful place, and of course it makes me feel so good inside, just like how Mr. Coffeehead makes all of us feel, right? Yeah. We all know about Mr. Coffeehead, right?
Yeah! Who's Mr. Coffeehead? Woo!
You don't know?
No.
I'll show you. What does it mean, eh? Mr. Coffeehead, like, what does it mean, eh? Mr. Coffeehead, like, what does it mean, eh? Mr. Coffeehead, like, what does it mean? Mr. Coffeehead, what does it mean? Will I be direct or will I Mr. Bean? Absurd for odd's sake or bike life surreal? Have you considered why you laugh at people and banana peels? Am I for the family or for the obscene or for like obscene families? You know what I mean. Am I telling the truth or is it just a mirage? Are we playing Carcassonne or are we playing...
I have a whole costume. Need to wait.
I don't know what to say really other than I'm just really full of gratitude for everyone showing up to this ridiculous idea thing that is happening right now.
I think we have to find it. That's what I've been telling you. That's why we're... Oh, I know. I can
I'm gonna pretend to hold it. I'm gonna walk this way.
hold it. I think we actually put it...
I'm gonna pretend to put it in that stump. Oh no, I can't put it on a stump. I'll put it behind here.
Yeah, so I was a youth worker for, like as I mentioned, for 10 years and did a lot of youth work in small communities across BC. So Squamish, Vernon, Whitehorse, so on. And when I was in Squamish, I really noticed sort of the impact of community economies on young people. And so I thought, I'm gonna get a little more interested around how economies operate and what that could look like. And so I went and did a degree, international business management degree. And from there, I worked internationally for a little bit. And when I came back to Vancouver, I was hired by the Canadian Mental Health Association in Vancouver to start and run social enterprises that employ people with significant serious mental illness. And so I worked doing that, starting and running cafes, catering businesses, cleaning businesses, and from there I became really interested in social enterprise, especially social enterprises that have deep purpose, and those were employment-based social enterprises. So I ran and operated those for a bit. Then I worked for another organization that was as their director of social enterprise, but using a different social enterprise model. So again, a nonprofit that had a mandate not to accept government grants. And so from there, we looked at how to create a diverse revenue model using partnerships, sponsorships, fee-for-service, a whole bunch of different ways of running that nonprofit. So I learned a lot from being the director of social enterprise there. And then when I moved to Victoria, I looked around for sort of the social enterprise sector, and at that time, sort of like 2010-ish, Vancouver had quite a robust social enterprise sector. When I moved to Victoria, there wasn't very much going on. So partnered up with other people in the community that were interested in social enterprise, and we launched an initiative called Social Enterprise Catalyst, which ran for 3 years, and that's where I really worked with Kristi, met Lee Herrin, learned about how they were operating their organizations, their nonprofits, and how they were operating them in a way that was combining assets and revenue and partnerships and really interesting approaches that allowed them to run their organizations in, what I'm going to say, like an enterprising, abundant way. And we thought, what if we could assist lots of organizations in the nonprofit sector to implement a mixed revenue and asset and strong financial models underneath them? How could that transform organizations away from grant dependency into being able to serve their communities through a mix of revenues and strategies? So that started Scale Collaborative.
Scale, one of the tricky things with profiling you guys as an organization is you wear so many different hats. And so it's sort of tricky to almost distill it to this is what Scale does, because you guys do so many things. So I guess, how do you describe sort of your role with Scale and kind of your main objective, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, Scale's main objective is to build a strong, thriving, abundant social change sector. Nonprofits, charities primarily, but also we recognize that strong social impact organizations can also be cooperatives and for-profits. Our goal is to help build a strong sector, and we do that in a few different ways. So we look at the capacity building piece, and that's thriving nonprofits and programs. Our coaching and consulting work is really capacity building and support to individual organizations. And then we have an impact investment fund called Thrive Impact Fund. Mm-hmm. I'm the managing director of Thrive Impact Fund because a lot of those organizations have difficulty accessing financing and flexible patient equity-like financing. So Thrive Impact Fund was created to fill that gap. And so we have sort of shifting culture, building capacity, bringing capital to help support growth. And so I run the Thrive Impact Fund. And then the other thing that adds into it is then how also do we create innovation, research, and new ideas. And so we also have an arm's length charity called Scale Institute that does that kind of innovation work, kind of research and development, R&D kind of aspect. So between all of that, we're looking at how do we both equip individual nonprofits to become abundant and thrive, but also how do we create a shift in the nonprofit sector to create, I'm going to say, an enabling environment so any nonprofit and charity can thrive.
When you're working with nonprofits, mm-hmm. and this might be a tricky question, but is there a kernel that you feel like your perspective brings?
Sure.
A thing that often gets missed, or a message that you find yourself repeating?
The core of, I would say, Scale's practice, but also the particular, the unique value that I can bring is having been an enterprising nonprofit leader. And so many organizations struggle with, insufficient funding or, not knowing, with cash flow challenges and so on and so forth. So I've, again, had many of these experiences and also been fortunate and lucky, but we've been able to figure out how to buy buildings, build buildings, purchase businesses, sell buildings. And so I've been through a lot of those things. I haven't been through them 100 times. Because they're big events, the amount that you learn even doing it once or twice or 3 or 4 times or 5 times is huge. And if you've never done it before and you can talk to someone that has done it 5 times and can say, here's the things that you really need to know as you're getting into this. And if you do these things, you're going to regret it later. And if you do these things, you're going to set yourself up for success. That's like incredibly valuable to people at that stage. And they don't always find, like there's lawyers, there's accountants, there's realtors, there's the bank and so on, and they can tell you how to borrow money, how to write a sale agreement, how to, purchase a piece of property and do due diligence and so on. But they don't know how to counsel a nonprofit leader and how to get their board to agree. Or the things that they need to think through in communicating with their membership, or all of the little bits and pieces that can happen, can go wrong, can throw us a monkey wrench into the thing. And so, like I say, I've learned a lot of lessons the hard way, and I'm very keen to, like I say, accelerate people's ability to get on with doing fun and exciting stuff for the community.
Can you expand on sort of what Thrive does? Because I know there's sort of 2 different branches of Thrive.
I would say Scale Collaborative is the umbrella organization, and we have inside Scale Collaborative, we have thriving nonprofits, capacity building programs, and consulting, and that really deep level of coaching and consulting support. Thrive Impact Fund is impact investment fund that can support nonprofits, charities, for-profit social enterprises, co-ops, with really patient and flexible capital. And so that Thrive Impact Fund is for British Columbia organizations, whereas Thriving Nonprofits supports all of Canada.
Okay, and then
and beyond.
Where does the funding come for that? Like, do you have private investors or
Yeah, there's different investors that come in. It is an investment fund.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just a very, very focused impact investment fund. And we took a long time to really figure out how can you actually invest into nonprofits and charities.
Mm-hmm.
So because there is no, they have different structures. There's no collateral in the natural sense that we think of. You can't give away equity shares like in a VC fund because, of course, not the nonprofit and charity is owned by community. And so there are no shares to be given. I would say the Impact Fund, Thrive Impact Fund, uses equity-like debt to be able to support organizations.
I, at that point, was sort of nominally amongst the Scale leadership team, sort of running the dock. I try to take a fairly light touch to running the dock now, but then it was like really a big question. At the time, also, a few months into the pandemic, the person who was sort of our nominal manager of the dock was a lovely gal, but her mother was ill and she had to leave town to go and be with her mother, and so she left suddenly. Not like she didn't sort of run out in the night or anything, but it was like, my mother's taking a turn and I'm moving out of town tomorrow, kind of a thing. And so it was it was really awkward. There was nothing going on here. I use this analogy, it's not a very good one, but you could have shot a cannon through the dock and not hit anyone in April of 2020.